2020, Info-Secte debuted the Dianne Casoni International Award, a literary prize to honor the memory of the late Professor Casoni, a psychologist and professor of criminology at the Université de Montréal, who made substantial contributions in the study of cultic phenomena, group dynamics, and radicalization, and who worked closely with former members of high-control groups. In 2024, we were honored to award this prize, in the popular literature category, to Gillie Jenkinson for her therapy workbook, Walking Free from the Trauma of Coercive, Cultic and Spiritual Abuse. Today, Gillie joins us from the UK so that we may meet the author. Welcome, Gillie.
Thank you for having me. It's a real privilege.
It's our pleasure. So, in Walking Free, it's clear that you're drawing from many years of experience as a therapist, as well as from personal experience. How did you first come to realize that there was a need for this book?
Yeah, well, it goes back a lot of years now. Probably 30 years ago, I realized as I was leaving sort of coercive, spiritually abusive situations, I realized that there were no therapists who were trained and understood how to help former members. And so it kind of evolved. The book is from a long evolution of many different things, of me having my own very abusive cultic experience here in the UK in a relatively small group, and then leaving, not being able to find someone who was ethical and who understood, which that was key to me. And then needing to train. So I've done research into what helps former cult members recover and tried to really work with that. And then the book has really evolved out of that. Yeah, so it's a long evolution. Also, I went to Wellspring Retreat and Resource Center in Ohio twice as an intern. So they contributed a lot to this whole evolution and journey that I've been on.
Thank you. Do you want to speak a little further about what Wellspring is?
So Wellspring is now closed, but it was founded by Dr. Paul Martin a lot of years ago. Actually, haven't got the date. And they were the only mental health facility in the world at one time who specifically worked with people from cults and spiritual abuse. And nowadays they would call it religious trauma as well, but they hadn't coined that term then. And it was a mental health facility, but it was out in the countryside in Ohio, in the foothills of the Appalachians. And I had a great adventure going there. I was scared stiff. I'd only been out of my cult for about 4 years. I'd done a diploma in pastoral counselling and heard Dr. Paul Martin speak at an ICSA, International Cultic Studies Association conference in Chicago in 1998. And that was my very first conference. I've been to about 20 since. And it was a wonderful experience. I was working with people who only specialised with former members. They had silly cartoons on the wall. I honestly felt like I'd landed on my home planet. That's what I felt like, because there's so little and way more now. But back when I left in 95, there was nothing really. There were no gatherings of people or support groups. And so that was, it was healing for me. But I went specifically as an intern. I shadowed the sessions. The clients were really kind and let me sit in on the therapist sessions. So they on the weekdays, they'd have 2 hours of therapy with Dr. Martin and Dr. Ron Burks, who's also very active in this field and has moved on from Wellspring years ago. And then in the afternoon, Larry Pyle did sort of psychoeducation. And the thing that I did is in the therapy I offer, which I called post-cult counselling, and I now call walking free counselling based on the name of the book, I amalgamated the therapy aspect with the psychoeducation. But you could say that walking free, which is really a lot of psychoeducation or the information that people need in order to recover, what I discovered. There'll be other things, but this is what I put together.
Yeah. On a related note, Walking Free does address both therapists who use it to structure their work with survivors and
Yes.
for survivors themselves who can choose to use the book independently. Did you
Yes.
find the writing process of addressing both of these audiences challenging?
Yeah, in a word, very, because there was a lot that I wanted to say. The book is based on the clinical work that I do with clients. So I've tried and tested it, the areas that we cover, the milestones, for anyone who wants to have a look in Walking Free. I set the milestones as the subject areas for where people might stop and unpack their baggage. And I tried it many, many, many times. The point about Walking Free was I would put my voice into it and explain things so that it could stand alone as a book. But it started as actually a book for therapists. You wouldn't believe how many iterations of it I have, and just so many thoughts. And then finally, when we went into lockdown, actually around this time of year, probably 2020, it's sort of just suddenly clarified. I find this happens for me with these sort of creative things. If I just let them bubble away, it sort of becomes clear, and it became clear that it was going to be for former members, survivors, whatever you want to call us, and with some information for therapists in at the end.
Touch a bit more on what you were describing in terms of the metaphors of the book. So the book is structured around this idea of walking on a journey through hilly terrain, stopping and reflecting at milestones and waymarkers, and resting in an oasis of self-care. At the start of the book, you give some suggestions as to how someone might create this particular oasis for themselves. And you call back through the book to the need to engage in that self-care very deliberately. Do you find that this is something that the survivors that you've worked with struggle with?
I mean, absolutely. I think, one of the things, as you know, coming out of these highly coercive cultic situations, it's a high demand situation. People are working for the group or the relationship. They're intensely working, and often they're on a mission. I was, and really doing nothing else. It's there are always exceptions, but the most high demand types of groups, there isn't time for hobbies or visiting family or doing something else. I mean, why would you? The world's going to end, and you're working to stop that happening, or you're working to save people, or whatever the mission is. So what happens is our autonomic nervous system becomes wired up for intensity, and it can be very difficult on leaving when suddenly you have time and space and there's no intensity, and memories can keep coming up and that sort of thing. So yes, I think it's a lot. It's a learning curve to actually put the brakes on or slow the car down and say, actually, I don't need to go at 100 miles an hour. I'm not saving the world anymore. And they need to deal with what I call those introjects, those things that we swallow hole that sit in our system, like, you know, if you rest, the world will implode, you know, and that may sound ridiculous to somebody who doesn't know anything about cults, but the extent of those kind of introjects they are so controlling and phobic. One person told me that their cult said they had to burn out for Jesus. And, you know, it's one thing having a faith and, you know, serving your church or something, but it's quite another thing to be told that's what you have to do. And of course, you swallow it whole, it sits in you, and then you burn out because you're being told to burn out. And until that's really grasped and grappled with, it can continue to cause havoc in somebody's life.
I suppose that can also be quite challenging when the new goal you've fixed for yourself is recovering from this, to then accept taking a pause and not rushing right through that recovery.
I mean, absolutely. You know, people will say, look, how long does it take to recover? You know, and we're all different, and trauma sits in us differently. For first generation, there may be trauma from time before the cult, and that may need addressing as well. And for second and multi-generation, often there's just one trauma after another. So, you know, it's kind of being realistic, but knowing actually there are things that are helpful to know and to understand that this isn't you, it's belongs to the cult, and that actually it's not true. You know, there's things that people are told that aren't true about them. You know, you're a wicked person, or you're a this, or you're that, and we swallow it whole, we introject it, and then we leave with that feeling. I left my cult thinking I was toxic. I mean, if you really take that on board, you feel that you are therefore going to be harmful to other people. And that was one that stuck with me for a long time, until I started to realize actually that isn't true. That isn't who I am or what I am. And other people have different versions, and they need challenging. They need articulating. The introject, I'm toxic, needs challenging with, well, that's not actually true. I'm not harming people. Sometimes I may upset people, but my intention is to be, you know, a benign person, to be kind and to be helpful, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So
Good.
the term you're using there, introject, comes from the context of Gestalt therapy.
Yes.
So what first drew you to that approach, and how does it work into the context of therapy with survivors?
Yes. Well, I did a diploma in pastoral counselling, which was a 4-year training. And then I went to Wellspring, practiced for a bit, and then I wanted to do a master's because I wanted to, the pastoral counselling diploma was an eclectic training. It was very good. And actually it was part of my exiting from abusive churches, because they were very balanced and really fantastic Christian trainers that I met who weren't cultic at all. My group was a Bible-based group. And an eclectic training introduces you to all the different types of modalities of training that you can do. But I wanted to have a sort of solid base of one kind of modality. And so I decided to do Gestalt. I was going to do integrative, which again is more of a sort of integrated, eclectic approach. But at the last minute, really, I decided to do Gestalt, not knowing a huge amount about it, I have to say. I couldn't understand half the language they use. It's a phenomenological, existential approach to counselling. Well, I actually understand that now, but I couldn't work out what that meant. I had to sit with the dictionary. but a lot of the concepts and ideas, like the introjects, have been very helpful, and I'm really glad I did it. So it was to create like a base of one modality, if that's clear, yeah.
I find especially that concept of the introject has a lot of application in this area. Um, I suppose, do you want to explain it a little bit further?
Yes. So an introject is a Gestalt term for a belief or behavior which you've swallowed whole. So the belief might be you are sinful, or Armageddon is coming, or you're going to hell. It could be all sorts of things that are applied in a very particular way in that coercive setting. So you swallow it whole, and if you think of the digestive system, it sits in your system and it's not chewed over. You just swallow it. In that high demand setting, somebody will say, you're this or you're that, or, you must do this or you must lie. I know one group where people lied regularly. It's a Bible-based group. It's quite shocking how they are told to lie. It's just part of it's rationalized as being allowed, somehow. I mean, it's just not right. I mean, it's not, it's just, there's no rationale for it in the Bible, that's for sure. And so somebody takes that on board, it's going right against all their own morals and something that they've never done before. And so they're actually swallowing something whole. They're then starting to behave in a certain way. They've introjected it and it sits in them. It causes discomfort, but they can't get rid of it because they're in that setting. And it's actually, I think dealing with introjects and these beliefs, and there's a whole chapter or milestone on introjects in Walking Free. It's fundamental to actually coming back to our or learning what is our authentic identity and who am I. I'm not a person who lies. I don't want to lie. Um, and thankfully my group didn't make me lie, but in this other group they do. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you. I want to get into a bit more of the different milestones.
Yeah.
So, the path that you outline includes several stages, going from leaving the abusive group or relationship, understanding the abusive milieu and its influence on the individual, recovering one's authentic identity, learning about trauma, boundary setting, and self love, understanding the dynamics of control, and emotional healing. So, what considerations went to selecting and putting each of these steps in this particular order?
A lot of trial and error went into, or a lot of trial, not so much error, but so the Walking Free is based on a much shorter recovery workbook. It's just we called it the recovery workbook for the purposes of the what I called post-cult counselling and now called Walking Free counselling. And that the different worksheets within the recovery workbook were trialed in different orders. And I realized that it didn't make an awful lot of difference to the end result, which was often very positive when they'd worked through the whole workbook, which has some of the milestones in it, that actually they were starting to really walk free and actually made a big difference. And so Walking Free, I changed the order slightly Do you know, I can't even remember why now. I think it just seemed to fit better, seemed to flow better. But as I say at the beginning of the book, you know, just think about what you want to do. If you want to go through all the milestones in order, some people like everything in order, they have to read everything, and other people like to jump around and look at it, look at different ones. Sometimes they refer back to other milestones, so they may not make full sense, but you can always go back and check what another milestone said about a particular subject.
Except, of course, leaving the environment, which you emphasize as being pretty fundamental for starting the recovery process.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. It's complicated. It's really complicated because for somebody who's second or multi-generation, who's leaving the group, or even first generation who are leaving the group and leaving family behind, those ties make it very hard to leave psychologically. And I hope I've, you know, sort of reflected that in the leaving chapter. It's not black and white or all and nothing. It's complex, but I think the first step is to physically get out. I found trying to work with people who are leaving mentally but haven't physically left the family home or who are in the family are still in the cult. It's very hard for them to do this process and to recover. So we have to do the best we can. And it's better, you know, I think to understand the theories that are in the book as much as you can and do the best you can with it, you know, even though it's complex.
One of the theories in the book and areas where I know you've published quite a number of articles, aside from the material in the book, is on the concept of pseudo-identity and rediscovering authentic identity. So I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you what is pseudo-identity and why did you hone in on this topic?
Okay, so the first person or people that I know of who started to kind of coin the term pseudo-identity was Dr. Paul Martin, who I mentioned, who was the founder and director of Wellspring, and Jolyon West, who was a psychiatrist. It was West and Martin who wrote this paper on, I didn't check the actual name of it, but it was published in a book on dissociation. And ICSA had published the article as well. I can find the name of it. I should have found the name of it, but I didn't. So they talked about it being like a sort of like a shell around, like something that's sort of formed around somebody. But they put it in terms of being somewhat, I think they thought the process by which that formed was dissociation. So for my master's, I asked 8 former cult members what helps former members recover from an abusive cult experience. I asked the same question later on my PhD doctoral research. But for my master's, what came up was we need to get rid of the pseudo-identity. And it was get rid of it. And then it was a case of, well, what is it? And that was my paper that I published with ICSA in 2008, is what is it? We called it the pseudo-personality. I changed that and call it pseudo-identity now, and I've got a logic for that. And what came out of that, because it was for my Gestalt training, was that the pseudo-identity is an introjected identity. I'm a bad person. I'm a liar. I'm weak and lazy and I'm stupid and I'm toxic. That's a pseudo identity. it's come taken in from the cult and sits in the system, and it's formed a sense of self or identity that's not authentic. It doesn't actually belong to me. It's a foreign body. It belongs to the cult and not to me. It's not mine. It kind of became mine. And growing up in the cult, it feels like it's mine. But actually, so people say, but actually it needs chewing over, it needs articulating, and it needs challenging because it really is harmful. And then there's the creative journey and adventure and process of identifying what's really me, what's the real me. Call it the real me. I call it the authentic identity, just because, like, words, what do you call things? It's not going to be called a cabbage or something. So it's got to be called something that sits kind of in the field. So I trying to be very consistent with my theories and my thinking throughout, and that's where I got to with the authentic identity. But it's finding the real me. I love art. They wouldn't let me do art in the cult. This is an example. Or I love sports, and we couldn't play sports or football or tennis or whatever in the cult. But when I come out, wow, actually, I'm free now to do the things I love to do. And those are to do with my authentic identity. And I can start to build that sense of who I am and the real me over time by challenging the interjects and by starting to do some of the things I love to do. I hope that's clear and of interest.
I do frequently hear from people saying that that process of finding one's authentic identity can be really, very challenging. And so I find it interesting to have this body of work that addresses precisely that topic.
Good, good. Not everyone agrees with me, or, I've called it the pseudo identity because Paul Martin called it that, but I'm coming to a place where people know somewhat about introjects if they've read things that I've written, and I think a more accurate way of saying it is an is an introjected identity. I don't think it's dissociation. I think dissociation is a split in our personality, our identity. We split off in order to survive. I think that form a cult, that when we're in the cult and we're traumatized, we almost certainly dissociate. But I don't think the pseudo identity is dissociation, because that would make it an integral part of the real me. And I think it's a foreign body, so that idea of the shell around the egg, or the something else, that's what Paul Martin kind of talked about. It doesn't belong to me. And Fritz Perls talks about it being a foreign body when he talks about introjected material.
Hmm. I suppose that's also a bit more of a hopeful way to present this idea to people in therapy, is to say it's possible for you to get to a point where those very uncomfortable aspects of the way that you lived and the way that you felt about yourself in your former environment don't have to continue being a part of your life.
Exactly. It's so hopeful. It's so liberating. It's like, I'm not toxic. Yay, I'm not toxic. I can be a therapist. I can't be a therapist if I'm toxic. How can I be a therapist if I'm toxic? And if I believe I'm toxic, I can't do that work. And I'm not toxic. So,
So, a final question, also on a hopeful note. What have you been up to since finishing the book? And do you have any big projects in the works?
yes, at my young stage of my life, I do. I continue to work with clients, probably reducing that a bit more because I'm so I've trained therapists to work with what was post-cult counselling. We called it post-cult counselling when they trained. And I offered a certificate in post-cult counselling, which was a 5-day intensive for therapists who are trained, but who also have lived experience. And they have an opportunity to go through, well, now they might go through Walking Free, but we went through the original recovery workbook. And then they have 2 long weekends where I train them on how to use the model. Like, what are the ethics around it? What's the evolution of it? Talking about, working in this field very specifically. So it's quite different. It is a modality of its own, very much based on other people's work, as everything is. And they're always referenced. Paul Martin, so many others. And also, and drawing from Gestalt and other therapy models. So I've sort of integrated those. So I am going to do, I've had so much interest in this certificate that there's too many people interested. So I'm going to, later in the year, I'm just planning it now, deliver a certificate or 2. I'm still working on how to address the need, but to keep it as it is rather than making it diluting the impact of how well it worked in the other 2 trainings. I went to New Zealand this last year. I had 2 months in Australia and New Zealand. I was the keynote speaker at the Decult conference, which I'm very honoured to have done that. And I also delivered lots of different workshops for survivors and for therapists in Brisbane, Perth, Christchurch. And then had a holiday there because I go back to, you have to look after yourself. It was pretty well paced. I might go back, so that might be on the agenda. Not sure. It's a very long way. And then I probably have another book in me. I think probably it's a case of time, really, but to actually gather up what I teach in the certificate and to put that in a book for therapists. So there's a sort of reference to, how to do the model. And so I think that might happen in the sort of in tandem with the certificate as I pull my ideas together. So quite a lot when I'm at my age. So I'll see.
Keeping busy.
Yeah, I'll see, I'm having May off for a family event. So that'll be fun. So that's part of looking after myself because I have to take it seriously as well. So yeah, thank you for asking.
Thank you for spending this time today and for all the work that you've put into this area.
Thank you.